It's a crazy time for the Minnesota Wild. Their best player is injured. Another player has a suspension looming, and the trade deadline is right around the corner. Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild is here to discuss how this team survives and what happens next. All that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the one and only Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild. And never a dull moment for the Wild, but certainly would like some better news than what you've been getting. Obviously, let's start with the Kaprizov injury. The best player on the team going to miss, 4 weeks estimated. How does the Wild get through these 4 weeks without Kaprizov?
Well, I think they put the blueprint on the table in the first 2 games after Kaprizov, after it was announced that he was going to be having surgery. The Wild beat Chicago and they beat Montreal, and in those 2 games they had 7 different players score goals. So it's going to have to be a committee approach. This is a team that has made their way so far this year by playing really stingy defense, getting really good goaltending, and getting timely scoring. You know, if they can get a couple of players to give them goals here or there, or a couple of lines that can give them goals on any given night, that's going to go a long way for them winning games. Unfortunately, then you had what happened against the Ottawa Senators, which is just nowhere near what the team needs to do. And I can forgive a lot, Gil. I can forgive just not having it. You know, for whatever reason, you go in and that night you don't have your best stuff. But I can't really forgive the no-shows. And this is a Wild team that has won a ton of games on the road, and they just walked into Ottawa thinking it was the Ottawa teams of old and that they were going to be able to sleepwalk their way to 2 points. And boy, did Ottawa prove them wrong. 3 power play goals, a shorthanded goal. So those demons are still kind of lurking for this Minnesota Wild team. If they are going to keep the blueprint going that John Hines has put together, it requires that they play very, very within themselves. Nobody tries to do too much. Nobody tries to take the game into their own hands, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. But it's just the blueprint and the formula is right there, and yet I think it's equally as frustrating too, because you had such a good effort game against the Montreal Canadiens. Because the team wanted to win one for Marc-Andre Fleury. They were laying out to try to make things happen. And you just get the polar opposite against the Ottawa Senators. And so I don't know if it just was the assumption of, you know, we've won a ton of games on the road, so we can just show up and that's going to be enough. That's not the case in the NHL. So the blueprint is there, but that doesn't make what happened in their most recent game any less frustrating.
Are there any players in particular? I mean, you said it's picking this offense up by committee, but are there a couple of guys who you think are the keys to allowing that to happen?
The team is going to lean on the likes of Marco Rossi, Matt Boldy, Matt Zuccarello. Those are probably your top 3 guys from a scoring perspective that you really need to be the ones driving the bus, pushing the tempo. But the thing that has been really refreshing over the last couple of games here since the surgery announcement was the Wild were getting an actual scoring component from their 4th line, something that has just been completely non-existent through most of the season. They had scored 2 goals, and they scored against Chicago. They scored against Montreal. Obviously didn't score against Ottawa at all. But if the Wild can get a couple of players to kind of take the lead And then, okay, tonight it's going to be the fourth line. Tonight it's going to be the third line. Tonight it's going to be the second line. That can win them games. It's just a matter of making sure that those guys at the top don't go too cold, because those are the stretches that you really just can't afford to have at this point.
Got to ask about the possible and probable suspension of Ryan Hartman. Talk to me about what happened, why it happened, and what do you expect the Department of Player Safety to come down with?
So what this stemmed from was Hartman believed that he was the victim of what should have been a penalty. Tim Stützle, I think, slashed him at a point earlier in the game. Hartman thought it should have been a penalty. He took exception to it, obviously. And so then later on in the game, he elected to essentially pile drive Stützle's head into the ice. His helmet came off. He had a large gash on his face. So at that point, then Hartman gets the match penalty, and already the league has sent him an invitation for an in-person hearing, which means that the potential for upwards of 5 or 6 games for suspension is on the table. What Ryan Hartman does not have going for him in this case, and I'll get to what the suspension is likely going to be, because there is going to be a suspension.
Yeah.
Because this is his fifth offense. So repeat offender, to say the least. So this is going to be a 5 or 6 game suspension, which will likely take up the rest of the month of February. And I understand being frustrated about not having a penalty called when you feel like it was a pretty blatant penalty that should have been called. But why are you taking it out? Why are you taking it out on the opposing team? Because guess what happened, Gil, after Hartman got the match penalty and the Senators got their 5-minute power play. They scored 3 power play goals in about 20 seconds. So you are then having to sit in the locker room and watch your team have to try to cover your rear end because you got selfish and decided that you were going to take the game into your own hands. That I do not have any time for. I cannot stand for that. Frankly, it was embarrassing because earlier in the day, we had recorded, me and Locked On Senators recorded a nice preview of the game. We were excited for it because the Senators are good for the first time in ever, and we were excited for what should have been a fun matchup. But then this kind of stuff happens, and it just takes all the fun out of the game. And then you're fielding questions about whether or not your team is dirty, whether you've got goon players on the roster. And I don't have any time for that. So whatever Hartman gets as a suspension is more than deserved. And he's going to put the team in a real bind by being on the bench for probably 5 or 6 games.
And obviously with Kaprizov out, you need all hands on deck. And now you're missing another key player.
Yeah. And it was to the point now the team has put Kirill on long-term injured reserve to be able to afford to have an extra roster spot. But before that, they would have had to put somebody on waivers in order to even get an extra player on the roster. Because for a suspension, you're on the roster. You don't get roster relief for that. So there's a lot of different wrinkles that cost them in the game because of the 3 power play goals that the Senators scored. And, just seeing reaction from Sens fans saying, like, let's keep running the score up and being like, honestly, do it. You just had it coming. And now having to deal with losing a guy that you expect to be a scorer on this team for 6 games, it just puts the team further behind the 8 ball at this point.
Trade deadline is about a month away right now, and you're going to have 10 days off for 4 nations in that time period. I know there's not a lot of cap space right now, but what, if anything, do you expect the Wild to do? Because they're, not comfortably in a playoff spot right now.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting because you would think by having all this long-term LTIR cap relief that you'd be able to go out and do something. Well, we don't play by the same rules that Tampa Bay and Vegas do, because the Wild are hoping that Kirill will be able to come back well before the season is done. So you got to be able to be cap compliant to get him back on the roster. So you can't really go out and get a $5 or $6 million guy and just say, oh, we'll figure it out later. Like, you're going to need Kirill down the stretch to either solidify where you're at in the standings right now, or to be playing hot potato with the rest of the wild card hopefuls for that wild card 1 or wild card 2 spot. So you're going to need him back. So that limits what the Wild are able to do. They're going to need, if they do anything, they're going to need a broker. Like, they're going to need to have somebody take on probably the other 50%. You're going to need to have the team controlling the player you're looking at retain 50%. So just as these injuries mount, it's looking less and less likely that the Wild will do anything major, maybe a depth piece, but I won't say no, because one thing that Bill Guerin has done throughout his tenure is he seems to be able to pull a card out of his sleeve pretty regularly. So I know the trendy link is your guy, Brock Nelson, but you got to contend with the fact now that the Islanders are playing better hockey and are probably going to try to talk themselves into being buyers. So Brock Nelson probably off the table, which kind of leads me towards maybe they try to pull a blockbuster and get Brock Besser. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But just the way things are kind of trending, I don't get the sense that there's going to be much, if anything, done at the deadline.
All right, Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Make sure to check out Locked On Wild. We'll have plenty of reaction to the looming suspension for Ryan Hartman, and just an absolute egg of a game against the Senators, as well as just teeing up here the rest of the week. As we get closer to the Four Nations face-off, you can check out Locked On Wild on social media and on YouTube, and you can follow me at Seth, Toups, as me, a casual basketball fan, tries to figure out what the heck the Dallas Mavericks are doing with Luka Doncic.
Yeah, a lot of people trying to figure that out. Seth, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Just bet $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59.